My name is Elizabeth Malampy, and I am one of the co-presidents of the Animal Law Society here at Harvard Law School. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'd like to thank especially our event co-sponsors, the Harvard Law School Animal Law and Policy Program, the Environmental Law Society, and Harvard Law School's Effective Altruism Group. Please also join us for the rest of the week, also from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern, for the rest of our amazing events. You can check out more on our website, the Animal Law and Policy Program's website. Today's panel will discuss the case ALDF et al. Versus the United States, currently on appeal in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which alleges that the federal government's policy of ignoring the climate crisis, and in many cases knowingly exacerbating it, violates Americans' right to be free because it's destroying our environment. Jessica Bloom is the lead attorney in the case and primarily practices in the areas of environmental, animal, open government, and land use law at Greenfire Law, PC. Previously, Jessica worked as an assistant attorney general in the Missouri Attorney General's Agriculture and Environment Division, senior staff attorney for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and deputy director of the San Francisco Ethics Commission. Santiago Gisosolo specializes in mathematically investigating topics with cultural, social, and/or environmental themes. He is currently collaborating to simulate the US livestock industry under policy changes and to analyze global supply chains and their social and environmental impacts in Brazil. He is a research associate at IM Econ, a research firm that works with the Animal Legal Defense Fund, Seeding Sovereignty, Center for Food Safety, HSUS, among other similar organizations. Cassie King is the communications lead for Having Kids, a nonprofit centered on the first and foremost human right, the right to a fair start in life. She'll discuss how investing more in each child to reduce childhood inequality is a necessary step on the path to environmental justice, animal liberation, and true democracy. She also is the communications director for the International Animal Rights Network, Direct Action Everywhere, based in Berkeley, California. Animal Law and Policy Program Executive Director Chris Green will moderate the conversation. If you have any questions for the panelists, please submit them through the Q&A function and we will pose them after the presentations. Thank you all and welcome.
All right, Jessica, if you'd like to start us off, then.
Sure, great, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and Santiago and Cassie, we're excited for the talk today. I'm going to start out by talking about the case that the Animal Legal Defense Fund brought along with Seeding Sovereignty and several of the members of both organizations. We filed that case in October of 2018. And in case some of you don't know who Seeding Sovereignty is, I assume most people know who the Animal Legal Defense Fund is, but Seeding Sovereignty is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation of indigenous rights of nature. It's founded by a collective of indigenous women, and they sort of cut their teeth opposing and organizing against the Dakota Access Pipeline. The idea behind the lawsuit is a deep desire to force the courts to recognize that the Constitution of the United States has long sort of been enshrined with the notion of a right to autonomy, which has been manifested in multiple cases to recognize rights that sort of come along with or are required in order to protect the right to autonomy. And we argue that the ultimate right to autonomy is meaningfully expressed only if the person who is expressing it can retreat to wilderness, which we call a zero baseline. And I'll explain that a little bit more later, but just sort of setting the stage for what we consider to be the only place where a right to autonomy can exist would be where there is no human influence, that is only in wilderness, and we call that a zero. So if you start at zero, an infringement on a right can only be assessed against that baseline, a baseline of wilderness, free from government interference. I'm here to tell you as a practical matter how we brought the case, and I'm also going to discuss how this case could affect animal and environmental policy going forward, whether we win or not. It starts a conversation. I'll then hand the microphone to Santiago and Cassie, who have so much more to say about that last piece because they're working right now to affect the meaningful and radical change necessary to both avert the climate crisis and, to be blunt, liberate all animals, both human and non-human, from the perils of government inaction on the biggest crises that our world faces today. And that's facing extinction through the climate crisis. So I mentioned we started this case in 2018, and I know that this group is full of lawyers and also just regular people who are interested in the topic. And so I'll sort of give a brief explanation of how you start a lawsuit. You do that by finding plaintiffs who have something called standing, and an explanation of standing is necessary because it underpins sort of the trajectory of our case and a related case so far. So to have standing to sue in federal court, you have to show that your plaintiff has suffered an injury in fact that's concrete and particularized, and also actual or imminent. You have to prove that your plaintiff's injury is traceable to the defendant's conduct, which basically means caused by the defendant's conduct. And you have to prove that the injury is likely to be redressed or remedied by favorable court decision. To establish redressability, a plaintiff must show that the relief they seek is substantially likely to redress their injury to some extent and within the court's power to award. So you don't have to prove it will completely resolve or redress your injury. You only must prove it will to some extent redress your injury. It has to be the redress has to be more than speculative, but it doesn't have to be guaranteed. So let me take a quick poll in that regard. How many of you recreate in wilderness? I won't be able to see, but just think about it in your mind. And how many of you need to experience wilderness in order to feel most like yourself? I know that I need to live in an area and be able to escape to wilderness with some frequency, or my mental health genuinely suffers. I start to feel suffocated by the urban environment in which I live. And how many of you feel so connected to wilderness that without it, your sense of self would suffer? I know that's true for me, and that's true for our plaintiffs. They understand that connection as well. And our plaintiffs include scientists, nature enthusiasts, and wildlife advocates who are no longer able to safely conduct research or interact with nature due to the catastrophic impacts of climate change. They fear increasingly severe and frequent wildfires, mudslides, and avalanches, and they cannot meaningfully connect with nature due to disappearing snowpack and edible plants, or they've been a victim of a flash flood or wildfire, all of which have been made worse due to damage caused by climate change. One of our plaintiffs is a wilderness guide and author who lives in a national forest whose trails have all been devastated by the wildfires over the last 5 years of increase that are just absolutely exploding in severity and frequency. So we allege that our federal government, through its affirmative subsidization of consumptive industries, and that includes industrial animal agriculture, fossil fuel development, and deforestation and timber harvesting, on America's public wildlands, has worsened the climate crisis, which in turn has caused the irreversible degradation of wilderness that our plaintiffs need to meaningfully exercise their rights to liberty and autonomy in their self-fulfillment, their self-actualization, their research, and in some cases, their livelihoods. In other words, without nature, our plaintiffs cannot meaningfully express their right to be let alone, which is guaranteed by the First, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments to the Constitution. We argue that without wilderness, without the ability to retreat, that guarantee is mere empty promise. So we sued the United States through the Department of Interior, Agriculture, the EPA, and the Department of Defense, the largest landholding industries in the country, in the United States District Court for the District of Oregon. And we asked the court for several remedies, which you'll recall must be fairly traceable to our injury to vindicate important interests. We asked for declaratory relief, which is essentially just the recognition that the plaintiffs and their members have a fundamental right to privacy and autonomy, and that right to be let alone and free from human inference in wilderness is a necessary condition to exercising those rights. And that's how we characterize the zero baseline model. This wilderness is the only appropriate measure against which to measure whether a right has been infringed. We would ask that the court prohibit the use of federal lands for animal agriculture. We ask the court to ban logging of old growth forests on federal land. We ask the courts to ban fossil fuel extraction, development, and the subsidization of any fossil fuel development on federal lands. We ask the court to direct the government to consider the impact on wilderness areas in its decision-making related to family planning policies. And that's going to be an interesting piece of Cassie's talk, because there's been some interesting movements in the legislative area on family planning policy recently that we think could dove nicely with that request. And then finally, we ask the court to appoint a special master to remedy a long-ailed issue in environmental and animal law, which is the failure of Congress to designate wilderness areas, despite the fact that wilderness study areas have been designated all across the country. So we're among activists and fellow allies here, and so I assume many of you have heard of a youth case against the federal government, styled as Kelsey Juliana versus the United States. It too was filed in the United States District Court for the District of Oregon, and it too alleged that the federal government had impermissibly infringed upon the youth plaintiff's constitutional right to liberty. However, the youth case differs from our case in very important respects. First, the youth alleged a violation of their 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. They argued that the federal government failed to protect their right to a livable future by privileging the rights of existing generations over theirs. Second, the youth argued that the federal government, through its affirmative actions to subsidize fossil fuels, violated their due process right to a livable future by failing to protect the atmosphere. And third, the youth argued that the government failed to protect the atmosphere as a resource held in public trust by the federal government for the benefit of all Americans. In their remedy, the youth asked for a structural injunction requiring the federal government to develop a national remedial plan to reduce or draw down greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to a sustainable level that was to be determined at trial. And ultimately, the district court had allowed them to proceed to trial. And at the last minute, the federal government applied for relief from the Ninth Circuit to stay the trial and hear an appeal on the merits. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the youth plaintiffs failed the redressability prong of that standing test we discussed, because the structural injunction they sought was that something that was as a policy matter should be left up to the legislative and executive branches. I think as a community, everyone disagrees with that ruling immensely and hopes that the Juliana plaintiffs can find success in what we understand to be an appeal to the Supreme Court on that issue. However, it does leave, some opportunity for our case to be distinguished, because we did not seek such a broad remedy. We seek those narrow remedies that we discussed before that are possible to be ordered by a court. But on the other hand, our case, we also lost, and we lost for 3 reasons. We lost because the court believed no single person could allege a concrete and particularized injury as a result of climate change, because climate change causes injury to all of us equally, and therefore our plaintiffs lacked standing to sue. We lost because the district court found that remedying the catastrophic impacts of climate change presents a political question inappropriate for judicial review. And in that way, the district court sort of found this in the same, the district court in the Juliana case conflated the redressability prong with this idea of a political question. Our district court judge just flat out said, our case presents a political question. We think the case law is on our side on that issue, and in the same way that the Juliana plaintiffs felt like their case law was on their side in that issue. But third, the district court decided against the merits of our case, finding there's no constitutional right to an environment. So where do we go from here? We've appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and we plan on asking the Ninth Circuit to recognize that our case presents a different question from the Juliana case, to find that we have standing because it is possible to have standing caused by climate injury. It is possible to have a particularized injury that differs from the rest of the population. And we want to ask the court to reach the merits of this case. And that's because we think that no matter what happens, if the court decides in our favor and recognizes the right to be let alone, based on this notion that wilderness is the ultimate expression of freedom, then we'll have a substantial victory for all animals. And if the court says no, no such right exists, we think that we'll have a substantial rallying cry for humanity. Because what could it possibly mean for us in a free society if there is no limitation on what the federal government can do to our wilderness areas and our ultimate wilderness heritage as a country, both existing, current Americans and Americans of indigenous populations. Certainly there has to be something that protects those rights. So with that, we hope that the court will establish that there is a very real right to liberty and autonomy that must mean something and couldn't mean anything in a world without wilderness.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. And next we'll have Santiago Gisosolo give his presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. I will share my screen. I've prepared some slides. Okay. I believe it's showing up. Great. Okay. So in this presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about this idea of preserving nature, having this spot of wilderness, and what it looks like when it's not being fully respected, which is something that has happened throughout history, but is happening very much right now in Brazil, among other places. So let me talk a little bit about Brazil. First of all, I'm Santiago. I've been introduced. Thank you. I work with an awesome team at IMEcon, Intelligent Analytics and Modeling, and we've been working with the Animal Legal Defense Fund and Seeding Sovereignty on a project recently. So what did we do? I'll get into it, but again, the project offers a peek into this idea of a world without nature, without wilderness, as it has been happening and as it is happening. But first, some related news. So in 2018, there was a court case in Colombia regarding the legal status of the rainforest. It was a similar case. The Supreme Court there admitted that Colombia was having trouble with deforestation, even after many regulations and international commitments. And a group of 25 young plaintiffs sued the Colombian government on a similar premise, that the government was not protecting their constitutional right to a healthy environment, life, and food and water. And this was a win. And the Supreme Court of Colombia recognized the Colombian Amazon as an entity subject to rights and ordered the government and other authorities to come up with action plans to seriously curb deforestation. Unfortunately, this hasn't been fully effective. If you look up some posterior news articles, you see that there are still issues. The government has not been respecting these action plans fully. But as Jessica was saying, this is a step in this very important direction. And anyway, let me get to what I worked on with ALDF and Seeding Sovereignty. So in August of 2019, there were many headlines around the world. On The Guardian, the Amazon fires. What is happening? Is there anything we can do? BBC, the Amazon fires. Nature, Amazon fires, right? And that's just a very, very small sample. But there was social media uproar. There was a lot more conversation about fires and deforestation in the Amazon than there had been for quite a long time. So Brazil has a history of deforestation. It didn't just happen in 2019. So why was 2019 a big deal, right? Let's see. So historically, we've already lost about 20% of the Amazon, 99% of which happened after 1970. Almost 10,000 square kilometers were deforested in 2019, a record in the last 11 years, right? So we're seeing now why what happened in August 2019 made so many headlines. In addition to the amount of land deforested, we have these other measures, right? We have the amount of fires and the number of outbreaks in 2019 was 72,000, an 82% increase from the previous year. There has been many policies and interventions that have greatly reduced deforestation, but it's rising again. Excuse my typo. Overall, these policies and interventions have helped the Amazon, but they haven't actually curbed deforestation at large. And I'll be making mention of this, and I'll mention some of these policies. So just to give you a picture of the history, at least until around the 1990s, we see that deforestation has largely decreased since 2004. We had enormous spikes in 1995 due to some relaxed government regulations that encouraged deforestation for cattle farming, etc. But we had this sharp decline. And what's been happening in 2019, let me zoom in here, is that it's been rising once more, right? And that's what the issue is that we did not want to see this happening. We did not want to see this go back up. Now, the importance of the Amazon is hard to overstate. It's rich biodiversity, over 3 million species, so many trees, rich indigenous cultures, languages, traditions, and knowledge, right? Generations of people that have lived in these ecosystems. And again, it's impossible to overstate what a disaster it would be to pass any kind of tipping point in relation to the Amazon, right? They're graded, but we don't want to even pass the first one. Let me share a little bit about the beauty, the ecological beauty and functions of the Amazon. There's this magnificent tree, the Samauma. It is enormous, as you can see. Its roots extend very deep underground, and it is able to pull up water from the deep soil. And in times of need, it redistributes water in the topsoil for the other plants. So that is one among many beautiful ecological phenomena in the rainforest. Beautiful images. It is definitely a fascinating place. Here's an image of an indigenous community. And beautiful animals, the macaw, this giant waxy monkey frog. I'm cheating a little bit because the names are in the citations, although this is definitely not Manuel, that's a sloth. We have the wakari monkey and this red howler monkey. And that's just a very tiny sample. And it's a shame to see that this is the reality right now, right? And has been the reality. But beyond the Amazon, and from my experience, my reading of news, international news, I have seen that some other important biomes have not received as much attention as the Amazon, but they are very crucial too. I'll focus on one of them in a second, but they're all influenced in one way or another, some more than others, by the agricultural industry, global supply chains. And the Cerrado, I feel, has not received too much attention, but has suffered a lot. And then we have several others. Let me move on. I don't want to take too much time. So the Cerrado is the Brazilian savanna. Again, rich biodiversity. It is right underneath the Amazon. There have been studies linking the Amazon's rainfall to the Cerrado's water supply, right? There are many interconnections between these ecosystems. Like I said, for decades, much attention has been placed on the Amazon. And because of this international focus, some high rates in the mid-2000s inspired some strong regulations. For example, the soy moratorium involving Greenpeace and others, and big agribusiness giants, US firms Cargill and Bunge, and the Brazilian firm Allege. And this lowered deforestation in the Amazon, but it didn't lower deforestation in general. In fact, it's like a conservation of mass. It just spilled into the Cerrado. Here's an interesting paper. Some of this seems obvious, that if people want to deforest, people want land, and we stop them from using the Amazon, they're just going to find another place, right? But in a way, it's very important to have these research papers and study the underlying mechanisms which this paper contributed. They show the spillover effects in Amazon conservation, and they make a very good point that these spillover effects need to be considered when planning conservation efforts. We don't want to focus our attention on one thing, make sure everything is okay there, but by making everything okay there, people are going to find other places to do what they want to do. Right? So they found that the decline in Amazon deforestation is linked to an increase in Cerrado deforestation. I'm going to make a quick advertisement for Complexity Sciences, which recognizes interconnections, encourages systems thinking. So in terms of these policies, I'm going to mention this quote from a professor whom I saw give a very good talk on this subject, that everything is a system composed of interdependent and interacting components, and ignoring these interconnections leads to unanticipated consequences. And another piece of wisdom regarding complexity sciences that was given to me by Dr. Don Sari is that thinking about these issues is similar to solving a Rubik's Cube. We can't just solve the yellow and then move to the green. We have to keep it up. We have to keep it all in mind because the parts interact. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of thinking in this way when tackling some of these issues. I have very little time. I'm sorry, everybody. So let me move very quickly here. The main culprits of deforestation in the Amazon and the Cerrado are the cattle and soy industry. There are many additional drivers, of course, logging and mining, land ownership, where Brazil has a very curious method of land ownership law, where if you occupy or burn unproductive land, you eventually get a deed. The time range, depending on the specifics, is usually 5 to 15 years. But then there's also the very sad state of fining and punishing these illegal acts. Because of impunity, even if it's easy to avoid the legal option because you're not going to have to pay the consequences. So for instance, in terms of deforestation, only around 1% of the fines in the last 25 years have been paid. So the soy and cattle, the thing, right, that's funny with this idea of preserving our wilderness, having this connection to nature guaranteed for ourselves and future generations, that is so important for our well-being, so many aspects of our well-being, is that what's driving us, what's driving all of this is in large part meat consumption, because even the soy is produced to feed livestock. And eating meat is so ingrained in our cultures. I lived in California for a while, and it was just so common to, for no reason at all, want to go to In-N-Out and just order a triple burger at In-N-Out for the laughs, you know? And so we're very disconnected from the consequences of our actions, especially these kinds of actions. And so, and here in Brazil too, it's very easy to just have a churrasco, a barbecue, every weekend or every day. No one is stopping. The price isn't stopping you either, right? Which is a big issue. And one that we are studying with ALDF as well on a separate project. And so this demand for some of these commodities drives up the demand for land. The demand for land causes land conflicts, which results in violence, most often towards indigenous communities and other people who work the land, like rubber tappers, for instance. And this, much like the biodiversity of the Amazon, it's impossible to overstate the richness and importance of Brazil's indigenous diversity and how we are violently losing a lot of these traditions, languages, and this knowledge. So specifically with ALDF and Ceding Sovereignty, we did a project investigating the role of the US in violence and deforestation in Brazil. We're very lucky to have organizations like ALDF and Ceding Sovereignty to work with, to produce such a report, and for all of the other organizations that work on these similar themes, collect data, create models, put people on the ground to interview, visit locations, right? There's a very active and very awesome. For our project, we specifically use the TRACE database and the CPT database. The TRACE project is unprecedented in the sense that they are trying to build this transparent global supply chain database, linking trading firms with specific quantities of deforestation in specific municipalities. They use some probabilistic methods to do so, but it is unprecedented and highly important, going back to that point where my friends would call me, ask me to go to In-N-Out, and then they would order a triple burger almost for laughs because we don't know the consequences of our actions. And I think Trace is playing a big role here by clearing up this idea of transparency. I'm going to blitz through my last slides. I wish I could do an audience participation question because I don't know how aware of some of these findings many people are. So curious, think for half a second, what do you think the role is? What is its extent and through what means, right? What is the role of the US in deforestation and violence in Brazil? We investigated the role through three main perspectives: imports into the US, trading firms acting globally, and financial institutions investing in firms that are causing deforestation. The US imports very little from Brazil, very, very little, which makes sense. The US has an enormous domestic soy and beef industry, which is very much propped up by the government and subsidies. There are federal checkoff and purchase programs but that's another, this plays into our other project with ALDF. But the big customers of Brazilian soy and beef are China, Hong Kong, and the EU. US firms, the top three global firms happen to be US based: Cargill, Bunge, and ADM, and together they're linked to about 63% of soy-driven deforestation. So they're not on the ground causing the deforestation, but they are moving these goods. Lastly, financial institutions have been linked to significant deforestation quantities. Some big names are Vanguard, T. Rowe Price, and BlackRock. And the top 10 US financiers are linked to about 21% of soy-driven deforestation. Another thing that we are doing in our study is linking violence and deforestation through statistical analysis. There has been some previous studies in this sense where people took what was happening in the state of Pará, where there were these issues of land occupations. I mentioned a little bit about Brazilian land law. And so they noticed there was a pattern in land occupations and deforestation in Pará. And then they extended that model to study the whole Amazon region to see if similar things were happening throughout. And their answer was in the affirmative. It seems like the pattern of deforestation and land occupations throughout the Amazon is similar to what was happening in Pará. And what we are doing is we have this amazing data from TRACE and CPT. CPT is a Brazilian organization that keeps track, they have been doing so for over a decade, of conflicts and violence over land. They do really amazing work. They scan newspaper articles, they send interviews, they have several local offices to collect this data. We did a pilot preliminary analysis with promising results to doing a regression of the violence data with the deforestation data. But we are extending this project to accommodate more sophisticated hypotheses. We're investigating the underlying intricacies. Like the previous project, they took the case of Pará and extended it to all of the Amazon. We want to find more detailed angles from which to approach this and find what is this relationship between violence and deforestation? Because it's not necessarily that one goes up, another will go up. It's a complex issue. Okay, Here, I was going to talk very briefly about our project with ALDF on subsidies and policy changes and how that would affect the US livestock industry. That's what these slides say. I'll close this with a quote from Dayara Tucano, an activist, Tucano indigenous woman, saying that it's not just about the Amazon. There's also the Cerrado, the Atlantic rainforest. And the forest is much more than a biome. It's a place for culture, history, memory. It's a spirit of life that's not just in the rainforest, it's in the deserts, the ocean, and everywhere. So thank you. And I added my email there. Feel free to ask. There's a Q&A, but also I can answer questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santiago and Jessica. I can jump in now. And don't worry, I talk pretty fast, so I think we'll be okay on time. But as you heard, I'm an animal rights activist, and I also work on children's rights, including the right of future generations of children to have a fair start ecologically and socially in life. And so from that mixed perspective that I have, I see so many similarities between the issues that we're tackling. And I'm excited to talk about how family planning fits into the conversation that we've been having so far. So some of those connections are probably already obvious, the ones you're thinking of immediately. There's the environmental impact of animal agriculture and the environmental impact of a growing population and increasing demand, including increasing demand of products of animal agriculture. So that environmental connection is pretty straightforward. And also that I think for a lot of us, there's a connection with protecting the vulnerable and the idea that animals are incredibly vulnerable in the situation that they've been placed into, and that they can't change their situation without help from human animals. So they need our help, just like children do, and especially future generations who can't speak up for themselves right now because they're not here yet. But in the legal context, and I'm not a lawyer, disclaimer, but I work on pushing the boundaries of the law and work with lawyers on high impact activism and that kind of grassroots perspective. But even for myself, I think it's easy to understand this idea of standing that Jessica was talking about, and how that is another really important similarity between these different issues and how they connect. Because animals lack standing in the courts. They're considered property under the law, and they're not considered persons. So they don't have the right to be represented or have their interests represented in court. At most, if you abuse someone else's companion animal, that person could take you to court, and it would be a conversation about violating their property, because that's what animals are considered. But similarly, future generations, they don't have standing in court either. And I think that that point Jessica made about one of the reasons that this case was dismissed the first time around being because it affects humanity equally, and there's no specific group that can or specific person that can say, I'm particularly affected and I need to have my grievances redressed, is really, think about what they're saying. They're admitting in the court that all of humanity is affected by the loss of wilderness and by global warming and the US inaction on this issue and action to the contrary, which is exactly why we can't do anything about it. It's not a very good argument. So I like the dilemma situation being posed that either they're going to agree to address this issue and declamatory relief and make a statement, or they're going to sort of have their hands tied and give us a trigger to take action. Why are you ignoring the right to nature or denying it? Which I think would be a powerful catalyst as well, whichever way the case goes. But I just want to talk about, these individuals who are left out of the legal system, future generations. It doesn't have to be that way. And it would be game changing for not just this case with ALDF and ceding sovereignty versus the US, but our entire court system, our entire legal system, our social system, every aspect of life would change drastically if we did take into account the rights of every child to a fair start in life. And that's the work that we're trying to do at Having Kids, is to elevate that right in discourse and in discourse around policies. Because we can build our society and our legal system and our democracy in a way that recognizes the right to a fair start in life and prioritizes it as the first and foremost human right. And I say that because if you don't have the right to a fair start in life, then your access to all other human rights is necessarily diminished. You're starting off disadvantaged. And that's why we really need a new model of planning families. It's the most comprehensive and effective way to protect kids, the animals, the rainforests, the right to nature. It's through new policies that ensure sustainable family planning. And that means it's a big shift for us to think about, because we think about planning families as what parents want, making sure that parents are able to do what they want when it works for them. And we're talking about a shift to focus on what children need rather than just what parents want. But that shift in how we think about things and changing the way that we plan for and invest in families requires us to think ahead and create long-run change. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that is missing right now in our environmental struggles, and in many of the struggles that we're facing today. We're just too short-sighted. So just to give a little bit of information you might not have had beforehand, you might know a lot about how to reduce carbon footprints in other ways, but a 2017 study from the Universities of London and British Columbia found that having one fewer child is 20 times more effective than any other action individuals can take to reduce their carbon footprints. I was pretty shocked to read that, because here I am advocating as an animal rights activist as well about how this is so tied to our environmental impact. But more than eating a plant-based diet or avoiding air travel or a number of other individual choices that people can make, having one fewer child is 20 times more effective. And I mean, that makes sense, because having a child and the child going on to do all those other things is the big impact. And of course, our individual choices aren't the way to sweeping change. We're not trying to get individuals to divest their funds from animal agriculture. We want the largest governments to do that. We're not trying to get court cases against the average Joe or Jane. We're trying to take on the federal government and the biggest corporations abusing the planet and its inhabitants. But when we do that, we need to be informed with the data. We need to include early childhood investment and sustainable family planning in our demands. Otherwise, we're just missing a huge piece of the puzzle. So imagine our world in 25 years from now, if all kids had equal access to nutrition, healthcare, quality education, and a community that's concerned for their well-being. Of course, that world protects the right to nature, because that is a world where every person's right is respected. Every person's right to a fair start, including future generations, is respected. And as much as we're suffering the loss of wilderness right now and species extinction, and thinking about our kids not being able to understand the world the way it was when we were growing up, the more generations that you go out, the more that these repercussions exist for future generations, because the world will look increasingly different for them. And so the title of this talk is Rewilding as Animal Liberation, but I think one step removed from that, just a step back, is family planning as animal liberation, or sustainable family planning as rewilding as animal liberation. That would have been a doozy, but that would have been a fun title. And I also want to talk about the moment that we're in right now, because in the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of issues are becoming more salient and really crystallizing the need for change, and showing us how much human, animal, and planetary health are all connected. We might have known all this beforehand, but now it's like, yes, everyone else in the world is starting to talk about it and realize it, and look at factory farming, and right in the midst of the mounting climate crisis as well. There's just a lot more attention on these issues. Last month, the connection was discussed in a UN report called 2021 Critical Year to Reset Our Relationship with Nature. And the UN Secretary General was talking about how right now we require 1.6 Earths to maintain our population and living standards, both of which are rising, and that there's no choice but to transform how economies and societies value nature and urged commitment to future generations. So right now, this rhetoric is out there. And another way that the pandemic has crystallized the need for change is that it has exacerbated inequality. And among developed nations, the United States ranks #1 for inequality, and that gap is widening. So we already know, and politicians already know, that we need to invest more in children, but the way that we're going about it isn't going to provide a fair start to all of them. So I'll talk about just one example, but for context of this, childcare, for example, early on in the pandemic, many childcare providers shut down. And a September survey found that about 40% of working parents in the US had to change their employment situation since the pandemic began until September. Women were particularly hard hit, losing their jobs or just having to change their employment status, leave the workforce. And although since then many childcare centers have opened back up, they're still facing an uphill battle with finances. And so President Biden has put forth a massive child care and tax proposal to keep these child care centers open and help low-income families with child care and offer tax relief on the cost of having kids. But it's not intended to level the playing field for all kids. It's a generic response across the board to help families with children, but it's not intended to address the inequality among those families in the ways that are needed. So in the US, the net worth of the typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family. And instead of offering tax relief for having kids to any family, which just incentivizes having more kids, and it's a very economic focused perspective, what if President Biden were to cut benefits to wealthy families who don't need that funding and use those savings as cash incentives to power up family planning and early childhood investment systems in the United States, like baby bonds or subsidized delays to parenthood through a focus on women's education and guaranteed minimum income. Right now, I mean, Jessica alluded to this earlier, but Cory Booker has already proposed a baby bonds bill that has 15 co-sponsors in the Senate, including the Senate Majority Leader. And I mean, that's one specific example of a policy legislation right now that could invest more in children early on and combat the growing racial wealth gap. But the policy that we see from Biden is kind of the same rhetoric that's been used before, and opponents to Fair Start family planning can look to that to reinforce inequality and incentivize unsustainable population growth, just using babies to grow the economy. That's what economists would want, is to use childcare and just general child tax credits as incentives for people to have more kids to reverse the declining birth rate. And I mean, that's another impact of the pandemic, is that people are changing their minds about having kids or delaying when they're having kids or changing their minds about family size. A 2020 survey, I'm almost done. A 2020 survey conducted by the Guttmacher Institute found that in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, 34% of US women have either delayed their plans to have a child or reduced the number of children they plan to have. So trying to change their minds with money, rather than addressing the underlying issues that they're responding to when they decide that now is not the right time to bring their children into the world, or not more children, that's a short-sighted goal, and it ignores the underlying issues that they want to address in order to ensure that their children have a right to a fair start in life. So yeah, I'll just conclude by saying that in this pandemic, right now more than ever, this rhetoric is out there. The public is making connections between family planning, environmental crises, global public health, and inequality. They're recognizing it, but our policies haven't yet. And so that's our job, to keep pushing groundbreaking court cases and legal theories and being innovative with the ideas that we're putting out there, because even though right now they're somewhat theoretical, they're getting this idea into the discourse where it needs to be, so that we can recognize rights that are being ignored right now. Thank you.
Great, thank you all so much. We've got about 10 minutes for questions here. So I'll start the ball rolling with Jessica. What do you rely upon to suggest that a right to autonomy has always been protected by the US Constitution?
It's a good question. We have a lot. So we start with the notion that the founding fathers relied a lot on some philosophical thinkers of the day of the 1700s and 1800s, in particular when looking at the United States, or what would become the United States. They saw a vast wilderness and really hoped to recognize in the language of the Declaration of Independence and in preamble to the Constitution a right to be free from the government, and that only could be possible in a place like in America, where they had escaped a land of really dense population with an overlording king who was trying to rule them from afar. But if you look at the United States Supreme Court decisions that have sort of manifested over the years, beginning with the early recognition of a right to privacy, which isn't explicitly recognized by the Constitution either, as you'll maybe recall, it's in the penumbras of the Constitution. That right to privacy is really manifested in a right to be let alone. So it's always been expressed as a be free from government interference. And so we think that sort of implication in that jurisprudence, from Lawrence v. Texas to the latest marriage equality decisions, is a recognition that the right to be let alone has always existed in the Constitution. And so we just ask that the court recognize it in a way that makes sense by establishing what the right should be measured against. So if the right to be let alone and able to marry somebody has meaning, then the right to be let alone has to have sort of it must actually be possible to be let alone completely. And in a political system where the entire world is snatched up by some government, the only way that could possibly be true, and for the consent of the governed to matter, you'd have to be able to retreat.
And Santiago spoke a little bit about indigenous peoples, we've got First Nations peoples here. How does your work incorporate and protect the rights of those folks?
So our work to protect the rights of those folks in Brazil, at least. I'm not sure if this is targeted for the US. I'm sure it's Brazil, but yeah. So showing these statistical linkages and these transparencies as to what's driving these violent acts, these violent conflicts, and how creating it public knowledge that even though there were large efforts to create protected lands for indigenous communities throughout many of Brazil's biomes, that one fact I mentioned of the 1% of fines have been paid in the last many, many years. That's part of what they're getting away with, is invading these indigenous lands. So recently, these past year, mostly, the case of mining has infiltrated many indigenous lands. They brought coronavirus to many of these lands. But having this information more recorded, more well-known, is helpful in many ways. There was, I'm gonna cite, I don't remember it in too much detail, but I read an article about a case where a group of indigenous lawyers sued the Brazilian government regarding their maltreatment of the coronavirus pandemic, especially as it pertains to their communities, and large oversights in allowing miners, for instance, to come into their lands and things of this sort. So in the sense of getting this information out there, knowing the mechanisms behind what's causing and how things are unfolding and maybe will unfold, I think can place a lot of power at the hands of many people who are directly affected and maybe aren't, but want to help.
Okay, great. And Cassie, if I understand your argument about family planning, you're suggesting that larger families put a greater demand on our natural resources, especially with regards to climate change, causing more pollution and greenhouse gases, et cetera. So you're saying that we should encourage Americans to have fewer children. But isn't that goal at odds with the other right to body autonomy? That is, how do we encourage families without infringing on the related right to body autonomy in family planning decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is my argument. And especially in developed nations like the United States, we really need to lead the way on this issue because demand is not equal across the entire global human population. And we have higher demand here and greater impact on other countries like Brazil, for example. Um, how is that not at odds with the autonomy? This is sort of the taboo that is around talking about family planning and why it's so important to bring this into conversations around the other injustices and issues that we're facing and where it's relevant. Because people have a sense that talking about family planning is such a personal issue, that the family is this private body that shouldn't be discussed outside of the people within it. And I can understand where that comes from, but I also think we need to break that taboo because our families and the way that we plan them impact everyone else on the planet, non-human animals included. And we're not advocating to put all the pressure on the individuals. So we need a systems-wide change. We need President Biden to change these tax policies to help small families, to give children the rights that they need. And I think a nice way of thinking about it is that instead of talking just about numbers and the numbers of our population, the numbers of children in your family, the numbers themselves, we want to talk about the children because we're not just counting numbers, we're trying to make these children count. We want people to have children who are prepared for the future generations, whatever challenges they're going to face, which are mounting, to handle them well and not just survive, but to thrive. Hopefully if people agree with that message and understand them, if I did a good job conveying the relevancy in this conversation, and you can see the relevancy and the urgency of discussing sustainable models of planning families, then I hope we'll continue to interject it into future conversations about environmental policies, et cetera.
Okay. And we've got a question in the Q&A here. Says that given that humans treating the non-human world of biodiverse species as a human resource instead of habitat to be protected as a means of coexisting, since that fundamentally created the multiple ecological crises that threaten us, is there any sense of karma here? Is there any form of animal rights that would not involve now restoring the non-human world and their relative autonomy from humans so that they can self-determine? Jess, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah. I don't think so. I don't think that there can be really like in animal rights, we try to protect a number of different sort of categories of animals. We divide them up into farmed animals, companion animals, wild animals. And I think that misses a very critical point, which is that without wilderness and without wild animals, there is no global system of anything meaningful for any animal left. If we carve up all of the Brazilian rainforest in order to accommodate farmed animals and to allow cattle to be, raised and grazed there on grass instead of in trees, what have we done to the ability of all animals to sort of survive and thrive in our world? I think the really critical thing about the zero baseline model is to understand and recognize that it is indeed about a human right to be let alone and free from government interference in wilderness, but it's also about a right that lifts all animals up and protects all animals equally. And that's the biggest difference between our case and other cases that are out there, because other cases argue for a right to a sustainable atmosphere for humans, and humans can exist in any atmosphere. We can build tunnels and tubes, and even in current conditions today, humans are sustained. We are living, even though there's an absolute recognition that human caused climate change has already driven to extinction several animals and is on the way to driving to extinction other animals. We need to so that's sort of the notion that there cannot be animal liberation or animal autonomy, whether human or non-human, unless we have something worth protecting, and that is the entire global ecosystem.
Wonderful. Well, that landed right on the dot at 1 p.m. So that's a perfect way to end this wonderful conversation. So thank you very much to each of you, Jessica, Santiago, and Cassie, for taking the time to join us and to help educate our broader community on these issues. So again, thanks to our co-sponsors as well, and please check out the remaining talks that we have this week. Thank you
Thank
all
you.
again so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.